But by 1714, St. Petersburg was still a long way from being the European power center he envisioned, and Peter's years of hard living were about to catch up with him. Without his dogged will, the entire fantastic endeavor threatened to crumble, leaving Russia once again on the verge of chaos.
In 1698, Peter the Great issued a beard tax to be paid by anyone refusing to cut off their old-fashioned Russian beards in favor of a clean-shaven Western look.
For decades, Peter the Great had been monastically focused on his twofold task of turning Russia into a great empire and St. Petersburg into its glittering capital. With one exception, he still held his legendary bouts of drinking with his buddies, but as always, his hard partying had very little effect on his relentless energy. He defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War. He'd extended Russia's boundaries from the Baltic all the way to the Pacific. He built a new European capital. He built a navy. He built schools of engineering and science, and he'd increased Russian trade sevenfold. Military and politically, Russia had become an empire, but it still lacked the one element essential to all empires: prestige.
In 1714, Peter began sketching designs for a grand palace atop a 50-foot bluff overlooking the sea, 25 miles outside of St. Petersburg. He would call it Peterhof. The palace would be surrounded by over 600 acres of gardens and crowned by a gilded network of fountains running down the entire face of the bluff. Work on the monumental project began in 1716.
Large numbers of army soldiers were actually sent to the estate to dig the trenches that would feed the water through a pipe system to the fountains.
In 1719, the country's first hydraulic engineers began work on the intricate system.
The palace was built on the heights, and the heights are what feed the water. It's that drop, the gravity in that drop that actually powers the fountains.
Using the natural slope of the terrain and water from nearby springs, workers constructed a 14-mile gravity-fed system. The water was stored in upper reservoirs. In a flash, it was released to shoot through wooden pipes down a 50-foot cascade to the fountain's centerpiece. The speeding water accumulated enough force to shoot 65 feet into the air. The result was breathtaking. The fountains were so spectacular, they were dubbed Russia's Versailles. But Peter didn't have much time to enjoy his showpiece. In 1725, after wading into freezing water to save a drowning sailor, the great Peter took ill and died. By the end of his reign, Peter had taken Russia from a backward, isolated country to a state-of-the-art empire. But the job was far from done. It would be the ambitious and tenacious German wife of Peter's grandson who would complete St. Petersburg's transformation from a naval fort to the glittering capital we recognize today. Her name was Catherine the Great.
Catherine comes to power in the year 1762 by overthrowing her husband, who had been the Russian emperor for only 6 months. And she was able to quite easily topple him.
With her power secure, Catherine picks up where Peter the Great left off, transforming Russia into a world power.
As a foreigner, as a European, she virtually completed the process of Europeanization, which Peter the Great had begun at the beginning of the century. In fact, Catherine regarded herself as Peter's rightful heir.
In the 18th century, in order to be a successful monarch, you had to expand your territory, and this Catherine did brilliantly.
Catherine annexed some 200,000 square miles of territory, adding vast new wealth to Russia's coffers and expanding the empire to its greatest lengths to date.
Second, you were to introduce a wide-ranging program of reform, and this she did.
On the home front, Catherine used her new wealth to modernize her city. She was one of the first Russian rulers to address the squalid living conditions of Russia's poor, with plans for hospitals, sanitation, services, and schools.
Catherine, during her reign, set up architectural norms for the building of new towns, and she did, in fact, build 216 new towns, complete with plans for how the grid should be laid out, how the central square should be laid out, what kind of facades there should be, what kind of materials should be used in construction.
But Catherine's most prestigious building project was the renovation of her royal residence, the empire's most extravagant monument to self-indulgence, the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace was 3 stories high and 650 feet long. The entire exterior was decorated in more than 200 columns and over 150 carved statues. Inside, it contained more than 500 rooms, almost 4 times the number of rooms in the White House. Over the course of her reign, Catherine spearheaded a building boom unlike any the empire had ever seen. Her unrivaled power completely transformed St. Petersburg into an ostentatious and unashamed display of the culture, wealth, and power of the Russian Empire.
She wrote to one of her correspondents, "I can't stop myself from building, but building is like a disease. It's almost like alcoholism."
Unrestrained building wasn't the Tsarina's only vice. Behind the doors of the Winter Palace, Catherine was known for another form of patronage, taking good care of her numerous and often much younger lovers.
She was a hard-working woman. At night, she wanted to have male company. And there were a number of lovers. She treated them very nicely and very generously. She gave them land, she gave them serfs.
But Catherine's lavish court and her absolute power to give human beings as gifts symbolized the gulf that existed between the ruling elite and the average laboring Russian. While she sympathized with her subjects, on the throne of supreme power, Catherine's reforms went only so far. By the end of Catherine's reign in 1796, Russia was a superpower. But the country's strength brought it new glory and new enemies. By 1812, Europe's most ambitious general was engaged in a march of conquest across Europe, unlike any seen since the Roman Empire, and Russia was about to become his next victim.
Catherine the Great was the first leader to initiate a large-scale inoculation program. In 1768, she immunized herself and her subjects against smallpox.
At the time of her death in 1796, Catherine had added 200,000 square miles of territory to the Russian Empire. Over 40 million people were now considered Russians. When her grandson, Alexander I, took the throne in 1801, Russia was a major player in world affairs. This made Russia an alluring trophy for Europe's most dangerous general, Napoleon Bonaparte. And in 1812, Tsar Alexander would face a challenge unseen in Russia since the Mongol invasion 6 centuries earlier.
Napoleon posed a considerable threat to Russia. He had already brought virtually all of Europe under his control.
Napoleon entered Russia with an unprecedented army of over 500,000 men. The Russians knew they could not stop this army on the battlefield.